After our introduction to the book of Isaiah at the beginning of June, we looked at the first section of the book, chapters 1 through 12, noticing God's message, particularly concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Last week we moved on to the next section of the book, chapters 13 through 17, and really 13 through 23, that talk about the nations that surround Judah, the nations that have dealt with and have mistreated Judah, and God's holding of accountability to these nations, the results of their actions, as God will hold them accountable. And so we looked last week in chapters 13 through 17 at Babylon, at Assyria and Philistia, at Moab. We look this week at Ethiopia and especially Egypt. We look also at Tyre and Edom and Arabia, and again go back to Babylon, the true archenemy of God's people, and how God is going to deal with them. And then we'll actually even start into next week's session, maybe just a chapter to start us on some general statements about God's judgment. Chapters 24 through 27, we've grouped with chapters 28 through 35, but could easily be grouped with instead chapters 13 through 23. And in fact, I would probably group 13 through 27 as the second unit of the book of Isaiah. Robinson, you'll note, divides that into two sections. We're going to take at least 2.5 weeks to discuss that and then move on into the next section as well. This is the outline that we've been looking at, and again you can see that 24 through 27 could be combined with either chapters 13 through 23 or with chapters 28 through 35. We saw last week that many of the Hebrew prophets include information about the nations surrounding God's people. Amos began his book in the first 2 chapters talking about Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, and God's plans for them before he finally begins to talk about Israel and Judah. Jeremiah as well spent several chapters of his book talking about many of the nations that Isaiah will talk about. Jeremiah won't come until another century after Isaiah, but Isaiah, a century even before Isaiah, is addressing many of the same nations that Jeremiah will have a message about. And then Ezekiel as well, even later after Jeremiah, will deal with many of the nations that both Isaiah and Jeremiah had dealt with before him. In chapter 13, because Israel begins with this discussion of the nations with Babylon, we saw that many critics want to date the book later or ascribe this section to a later or different author. While Assyria is the immediate threat during the reigns of Ahaz and Hezekiah in particular, it's going to be after the death of Josiah a century later when Babylon is going to be the one that actually takes them into captivity. Babylon will be God's army, his agent of justice, and indeed the day of the Lord is near. Judah will suffer desolation, although ultimately Babylon will as well when God is finished with Babylon, just like he punished Assyria when he was finished with them, held accountable. We saw chapter 14, the taunts against the and 15 and 16 again, Moab. Chapter 17, Damascus. If you remember, Damascus and Ephraim had actually even aligned themselves together to threaten war against Judah, the southern kingdom under Ahaz, who refused to join them in a stand against Assyria. Ahaz had actually, in fact, tried to buy friendship with Assyria and form an allegiance with them. This week in chapter 18, we see a description of the fear and dread that's increasing in Ethiopia and, in fact, in every country that's in the path of the advancing Assyrian army. They've already defeated Damascus and Samaria. They've taken much of the land of Judah. They're heading toward Egypt and even Ethiopia. The wave of Assyria is coming toward them, and they are directly in the path. Chapter 18, verse 7 seems to refers to the homage and congratulations given to Judah for their success in turning Assyria back. Everyone prior to this had just fallen to Assyria, but as we'll see when we get to chapter 37, during Hezekiah's day, there's a Assyrian threat, and God overthrows the Assyrians in a single night, killing 185,000 Assyrian soldiers with a single angel. In Isaiah chapter 37, verses 36 through 37, we're told that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, all these were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And so Ethiopia, in recognition of this, recognizes the accomplishment of Judah. Egypt is given much more attention instead of just 7 verses. There's going to be the next 2 chapters, chapters 19 and 20, deal with the oracle concerning Egypt in chapter 19 and verse 1. And in chapter 19, verses 1 through 4, we see that Egypt is going to be delivered into the hands of a cruel master. The oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud, and is about to come to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. So I will incite Egyptians against Egyptians. They will each fight against his brother, and each against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. Then the spirit of the Egyptians would be demoralized within them, and I will confound their strategy, so that they will resort to idols and ghosts of the dead, and to mediums and to spirits. Moreover, I will deliver the Egyptians into the hand of a cruel master, and a mighty king will rule over them, declares the Lord God of hosts. Egypt is going to be challenged by Assyria. Even when Assyria passes and falls to the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar will continue to covet Egypt and that territory, and will control much of the territory. It will be controlled even more by the Medes and the Persians, as Cambyses makes even further inroads to Egypt, and then also by the Greeks, by Alexander the Great, who will build the city of Alexandria and be recognized as a pharaoh of Egypt. Of course, Alexander's empire is going to spread from Greece all the way across the old Persian Empire and into Asia, into India, before he dies suddenly at the age of 33 in Persia, when he is attempting to rebuild the city that God has prophesied will never be rebuilt. And indeed, Alexander dies and the city is never rebuilt, even to this day. The course of the Euphrates changed, and what used to be a fertile city is now desert and waste. Great cities of modern day Iraq are located in a different place, still along the Euphrates, but in a different place than it had been in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, in the days of Ezekiel and Daniel. Drought, climate change, economic ruin are what Egypt faces. They're going to be subjugated, as we said, to Assyria, Babylon, even more to Medo-Persian, to the Greeks, and finally, of course, to Rome. They're going to be just a resource center, a granary for Rome, as Rome places heavy burdens upon the impoverished country by that time. In chapters 19 and 20, we see that all of this is part of a purpose or a plan. This is not coincidence or accident, but in chapter 19 and verse 12, we read, "Well then, where are your wise men? Please let them tell you, and let them understand what the Lord of hosts has purposed against Egypt." Egypt had been known in ancient days as a center for wisdom. You'll remember Moses was trained in all the wisdom of Egypt, but Egypt has fallen through the centuries. And so now we see in verse 17, the land of Judah will become a terror to Egypt. Everyone to whom it is mentioned will be in dread of it, because of the purpose of the Lord of hosts, which he is purposing against them. This judgment against Egypt and against all the nations reveals God. It makes him known. Chapter 19 and verse 21, we're told, "Thus the Lord will make himself known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. They will even worship with sacrifice and offering. They will make a vow to the Lord and perform it." And just as Nebuchadnezzar is going to know that God reigns in the kingdom of men, as Daniel interprets his dream in Daniel chapter 4, that God will remove him from the throne just as he placed him on the throne. And all of this will bring a recognition, a realization to these foreign powers that they're not controlled by their gods, but indeed they're controlled of the only God, the God of heaven. We see this idea expressed again a century and a half later by Ezekiel in Ezekiel's prophecies regarding the nations. Ezekiel says in chapter 20, beginning in chapter 29, verse 3, "Speak and say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster that lies in the midst of the river, that has said, My now is mine, and I myself have made it." We see in verse 6 of this passage, he says, "Then all the inhabitants of Egypt will know that I am the Lord, because they have been only a staff made of reed to the house of Israel." Egypt will know. And in verse 19, he says of Egypt's fate, "Therefore, thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will give the land of Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off her wealth and capture her spoil and seize her plunder, and it will be wages for his army." In Ezekiel chapter 30 and verses 3 through 4, we read, "For the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds, a time of doom for the nations. A sword will come upon Egypt, and anguish will be in Ethiopia. When the slain fall in Egypt, they take away her wealth, and her foundations are torn down." In chapter 30, verse 8, it says, "And they will know that I am the Lord." Again, God is making himself known, not just to the people of Judah, but as he comes in judgment, every nation is being forced to recognize God's power and their accountability to his rule, to his reign. In Ezekiel chapter 32 and verse 15, one final passage on this subject. He says, when I make the land of Egypt a desolation, and the land is destitute of that which filled it, when I smite all those who live in it, then they shall know that I am the Lord. The knowledge of God is not just something that God is going to display to his people, but something that in fact he displays to all nations. Back in Isaiah chapter 20 and verses 2 through 3, I see a fascinating passage as Isaiah is told not only to speak a message, but to act out, to carry out actions that are illustrative of the message as well. Something that we see again and again through the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel again and again is told not only to say certain things, but to do things that are very odd and would arrest attention. Sitting on the ground with a towel, drawing a city and surrounding it with army men, like children playing in the dirt, playing army men. You know, digging a hole through the wall of his house and exiting out that way with his possessions instead of going through the front door to symbolize their being carried off into Babylonian captivity. The action that Isaiah is told to do in verse 2, and the Lord spoke to Isaiah the son of Amoz, saying, go and loosen the sackcloth from your hips and take your shoes off your feet. And he did so, going naked and barefoot. And here, naked is not used in the sense of having no clothing on at all, but as we see it oftentimes in both the Old and New Testament, it's referring to the idea of having very little clothing on, perhaps just a person in their undergarments and barefoot. You can imagine if you showed up at work in just your undergarments and barefoot, they might tell you to go home and get dressed. Uh, and so your clothing would be considered inappropriate. Someone might say, someone in a bathing suit that they're naked. Not that they don't have any clothes on, but the idea that they're not sufficiently covered. We see this, for example, in John chapter 21 and verse 7, when Peter is fishing in a boat and the Lord is on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and they catch the great draft of fish, and Peter, we're told, throws off his cloak and jumps into the water to swim to shore. And he's described as being naked when he throws off his cloak. The men fishing, they would fish in their tunics that they wore under their overgarments. But this is certainly would draw attention. A man barefoot. If Brother Pope were to come in one morning and preach for us barefoot in just his underwear, it would certainly attract some attention. But this is what Isaiah is told to do as an illustration of the message that he's going to give. And the message we see in verse 3, he says, even as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot 3 years as a sign and a token against Egypt and Cush, that is Ethiopia. And so the king of Assyria will lead away the captives of Egypt and the exiles of Cush, young and old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered to the shame of Egypt. And so just as captives may not even have the opportunity to dress fully, they're just dragged out of their homes and dragged to a place of captivity and just poorest of clothing. This is what Isaiah is representing to what is going to happen to Egypt. Again, God's plan for Egypt is judgment. 21, Isaiah returns to a topic that he began with when he talks about the nations around Judah. He had started in chapter 13 with the fate of Babylon. And you can look back at verses 17 through 19 of chapter 13 as Isaiah described this. He interprets what he's described here in verses 1 through 16 when he says in verse 17, behold, I am going to stir up the Medes against them, who will not value silver or take pleasure in gold, and their bows will mow down the young men, and they will not even have compassion on the fruit of the womb, nor will their eye pity children. And Babylon, the beauty of the kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Here in chapter 21 and verse 2, we're told, a harsh vision has been shown to me. The treacherous one still deals treacherously, and the destroyer still destroys. Go up, Elam, lay siege, Media. Just as in chapter 13, Isaiah had said that Media, Persia, and Medium, Persia and Media, Medo-Persian Empire. Elam is another name for Persia. They're going to be used as agents of judgment against Babylon. Also in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 21. Now behold, here comes a troop of riders, horsemen in pairs, and one said, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods are shattered on the ground. O my threshed people, and my afflicted of the threshing floor, what have I heard from the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, I make known to you. So again, God in acting in judgment demonstrates or makes himself known. He is the King of Kings. He is the ruler not only of heaven, but the ruler of earth as well. And chapter 21 then ends in verses 11 through 17 with the fates of Edom and Arabia. Chapter 11 says the oracles concerning Edom. One keeps calling to me from Tyre, Watchman, how far gone is the night? Watchman, how far gone is the night? The watchman says, morning comes, but also night. If you would inquire, come back again. Verse 13, we see the oracle about Arabia. In the thickets of Arabia you must spend the night, O caravans of Dedanites. Bring water for the thirsty, O inhabitants of the land of Tema. Meet the fugitive with bread, for they have fled from the swords, from the drawn sword, from the bent bow, and from the press of battle. For thus the Lord said to me, in a year as a hired man would count it, all the splendor of Kedar will terminate, and the remainder of the number of bowmen, the mighty men of the sons of Kedar, will be few. For the Lord God of Israel has spoken. God has spoken. In chapter 20, we see that Isaiah addresses the inappropriate response to God's warnings. God has given numerous warnings through the prophets. And instead of being ashamed and repentant, we see that the people are congratulating themselves and celebrating. They see themselves as a gift to God as rather than in need of God. In chapter 22, verse 15, in fact, God through Isaiah focuses on a specific individual, a man named Shebna. And this individual is preparing a tomb for himself, a memorial to glorify himself, that when he's dead, he will be buried and people will point to his tomb and talk about the greatness of Shebna. But that's not going to happen. Verse 18, he's about to be cast out and die in another country. Even the man that replaces him, Hilkiah, in verse 20, people will have trust and confidence in him, but he will only disappoint. Verse 20 says, then it will come about in that day that I will summon my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and he will replace Shebna, but while he'll set a key on the house of David on his shoulder. When he opens, no one will shut. When he shuts, no one will open. I will drive him like a peg in a firm place, and he will become a throne of glory to his father's house. So they will hang on him all the glory of his father's house, offspring and issue, all the least of vessels, from bowls to all jars. In that day declares the Lord of hosts, the peg driven in a firm place will give way. It will even break off and fall, and the load hanging on it will be cut off, for the Lord has spoken. So these individuals that they're placing confidence in are in fact going to fail them. They're going to be disappointed. It's only God that they can have confidence in. In chapter 23 of Isaiah, and you can compare also Ezekiel prophesies in great detail about the fate of Egypt in Ezekiel chapter 26. Again, you can look there for supplemental information to Isaiah's prophecy, but Isaiah's prophecy in chapter 23 concerning Tyre, the oracle concerning Tyre, and basically is summed up in the word destruction. He talks about the ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is destroyed without the house of harbor. It's reported to them that the land of Cyprus, be silent, you inhabitants of the coastland, you merchants of Sidon. Even though in verse 3 they're referred to as the market of the nations, even though they're referred to as a city of antiquity in verse 7, they're going to be destroyed. And Ezekiel in even more detail talks about how the nations that had come against them continually. It's interesting. Tyre was in fact a city that was built partly on the coast and partly on an island in the harbor. And so oftentimes when enemies came against Tyre, the people on the coast would evacuate to the island. It's kind of if you picture a situation today when a hurricane comes and people in the islands evacuate to the land, it's the reverse. The people on the land who are about to be attacked by an army evacuate to the island, and so they're protected, surrounded by water. And the island part of the city is surrounded by large walls and is prepared for defense, and so their enemy has to approach them by ships. But the people of Tyre have, on top of high walls and pouring down flaming pitch and other things that will catch the ships on fire. Even though every nation from Assyria on down through Alexander the Great will come against Tyre, they can destroy the mainland city under Assyria and Babylon and Persia. The island stronghold is never taken until Alexander the Great comes along. When he takes the city, the coastal city, he raises all the buildings and throws them into the harbor, making a causeway across to the island so that the island is no longer an island. It's actually just at the end of a causeway, an extension from the shore. And Alexander marches his troops right across the island. And it's interesting, if you look at maps of Tyre pre-Alexander, you see an island in the harbor. But after Alexander, there is no island. The mainland is actually joined to the island, or the island becomes joined to the mainland as Alexander builds this causeway across to it. And so he is the one who actually, in fact, finally does destroy the entire city, captures all of it, and he doesn't leave a stone on a stone. Every single stone is thrown into the water, and they walk across what used to be people's homes. And as Ezekiel describes it in chapter 26, people fish there, they lay their nets there. It's just like a jetty you might see on the coast today, where large rocks extend out into the water. And so again, this destruction of Tyre is something that is not a coincidence, but it's something that God controls. In chapter 23, verses 8 and 9, we read, "Who has planned this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were honored of the earth? The Lord of hosts has planned it, to defile the pride of all beauty, despise all the honored of the earth." In chapters 24 through 7, we will actually just maybe cover the first chapter of that section and continue next week with chapters 25, 26, and 27, and then move on into the relations between Judah and the nations, as Isaiah warns Judah not to form alliances, not to become entangled with these people that in fact God is going to judge. Even though he's going to use some of them to judge them, don't look to them for help or aid or assistance, because they're acting as God's agents, and because they are going to be cast aside and punished when he has used them and held accountable for their actions, which are not out of a desire to please God, but instead actions based on pride, arrogance, greed. It will accomplish God's purpose to carry his people into captivity and purify the nation and remove idolatry, but it's not something permanent as far as these nations are concerned. Many of them are going to pass into oblivion. In chapters 24 through 27, a more general description than the specific statements we've seen about individual countries in chapters 13 through 23. In chapter 24, we see in general the fact that God is going to lay waste, devastate, scatter. Some cities will be rebuilt, some will never be rebuilt. Whatever God's plan indicates, whatever he reveals, that's what's going to come to pass. As Isaiah said, the Lord has spoken. And so we read in chapter 24, verses 1 through 3, behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the servant like his master, the maid like her mistress, the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, and the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. And this is the result, we're told in verse 5, of the pollution of sin. The earth, he says in verse 5, is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. So while God desired to bless, instead they're going to receive the cursing instead of the blessing, just as Moses had warned in Leviticus 26 and in Deuteronomy 28. We're told in verse 6, therefore a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. So the problem that earth faces is the pollution of sin. The pollution of sin will always bring about cursing. It always bring about God's judgment. In chapter 24, verse 12, we see desolation is going to be left in the city as the gate is battered to ruins. This could be said of any number of nations. But the point is that God is going to punish the wicked in verse 21. So it will happen in that day that the Lord will punish the host of heaven on high and the kings of the earth on earth. It doesn't matter whether it's Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, God's own people, Judah, Israel. God will punish the wicked. There will be no evildoer that gets away with it. There won't be a righteous person who's accidentally punished that shouldn't be. As we're told in chapter 24, verse 23, God will reign. We're told the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. We'll continue looking at some of the general statements that are made about God's judgment, all his judgments, next week in chapters 26, 27, and 28, and then move into the next section. So basically this week and next week, we're covering 3 sections in 2 weeks. which will require some extra reading, but it will hopefully allow us enough time when we get to the latter portion of the book that talks about God's deliverance and future blessing that's going to come after the curse of judgment. We'll have enough time, I think 5 weeks, to look at the good news that follows this bad news that is immediately in their future. But toward the end of the book, we'll look past this immediate difficulty, tribulation, sorrow, to the joy that God has planned for his people as a result of his grace. So for next week, try to read chapters 25 through 35. Again, we'll probably have to cover this in a not verse by verse way, but kind of some just hitting the highest points. But I hope you enjoy your reading and study this week, and hope to see you here again next week. Thank you.
Are you coming here? I'll be in